Guys, welcome to Let's Get Local. It's a webinar presented by Project 2020 and ASAM News. I want to give a shout out to UNASA and YamYamF for creating Project 2020. The mission statement is to get 100,000 AAPIs registered to vote by the 2020 elections through raising awareness, providing education, and giving space for civic engagement on the local, regional, and national scale. Check out the website vote-2020-project.org and register or pledge to register to vote by November of this year, and what we'll talk about in this webinar every year after that. My name is Keith Chow. I am the founder of the Nerds of Color, host of the podcast Hard Knock Life and Southern Fried Aegeon, and your moderator for this evening. As we get started, I want to introduce my amazing panel of guests on this webinar, starting to my left, right? I don't know what your screen looks like.
I think we all see different things.
I want to introduce Romen Vos Borsellino. He is a political operative based in Iowa. He's now currently a comedy writer in Los Angeles, but he's worked in the Obama administration and on several campaigns in Iowa, which is, as we know, a very important state in elections, or it used to be until this year. Romen.
Check back in 4 years. Yeah.
Please introduce yourself and answer the question, why do you think it's important for Asian Americans to be involved in the electoral process?
Well, thank you very much, Keith. I'm excited to be here with you guys, Oz and Michelle. As Keith mentioned, I am currently in LA, but I grew up in Iowa, which, as you guys may know, is sort of the heart of political world, because every 4 years we are the first state to vote with our Iowa caucuses, and oftentimes the person who becomes president started out in the state of Iowa. Doing really grassroots stuff, meeting folks in local churches and high school gyms, shaking every hand. And so I've been fortunate enough to get that sort of firsthand perspective of getting to meet a lot of candidates and see how things work up close. I've worked on, I started as an intern on Barack Obama's 2007-2008 caucus campaign, back when he was down 30 points to Hillary Clinton and John Edwards. So to get to be a part of that really sort of shaped my my worldview and instilled in me why it is very important to get involved at the grassroots level. I've also worked on Senate races here in Iowa, one of them losing, unfortunately, but that has also given me a good perspective of what works and what doesn't, and worked on Obama's reelection campaign and in his administration in DC. To get right into it, Keith, your question, sort of why is it important for us, the Asian community, to get involved in this election. The fact is, it is going forward without us, whether we like it or not. And so it is on us to bring that seat to the table. No matter what, we will elect a new president, a new Congress, a new Senate, and up and down the ticket to the most local positions you could ever imagine. And folks are going to show up to vote. And if we don't participate, we'll be left out. And that really is sort of on us. And part of that is that, there is some institutional racism. There are ways in which the Asian community, though large in numbers, have generally been overlooked and not included. But this is where we change that. If we show up in numbers so big that they can't ignore, then we may not be courted in the way that we deserve this cycle. But I can assure you that in local elections in 2 years, in midterms, in the next presidential race, we will see the dividends of our involvement right now.
Excellent. Thank you, Romen. Right on my screen, at least, right beneath Romen, is an actress from Indonesia by way of San Francisco and New York. She is the star of a lot of things. You may know her from Netflix's 13 Reasons Why or CBS's Elementary. Please welcome to the webinar, Michele Selene Ang.
Hi, everyone. I'm Michelle, and I'm an actor and writer currently based in LA. Thank you so much for having me.
Same question to you. Why do you think it's important for Asian Americans to be involved in the process?
It's important because of representation. I believe that we deserve to have a stake in American politics and media and just representation across the board. I think what I can bring to the table, at least to this webinar today, is obviously from the world of like TV and film and then the entertainment industry. But I do know for a fact that like representation like matters, and that if like representation shows up in movies that directly, you know, relates to like politics as well, because I've seen firsthand how people are bolstered just by the sight of like other people who look like them in movies or TV, and thus they're like, okay, so we're part of this society. Don't you think we should also have a say in politics, in the real world stuff that's happening? So I could speak to that for sure, and I'm very happy to be here. So thank you for having me.
Sure, we're excited to have you. Next to Michele is an actor, director, producer, originally from Canada, but now he's registered to vote here in the U.S.
No, I'm not. I'm not registered to vote.
He will be by Project 2020. He is an actor. You know him from Supernatural, and he is also a superhero. Ryan Choi from the Crisis on Infinite Earths. Please welcome to the webinar, Osric Chau.
Thank you for including me on the 2020 project. So I full disclaimer, I'm Canadian. I have a green card, so I live here, but I am not allowed to vote. That being said, doesn't mean I can't be part of the political process and continue to educate myself. And part of that is me discovering all of the reasons why it is important to be involved and to vote, because this is the only way we really have a voice, right, in the political system that affects us. And I think for too long, our cultures, our communities have kind of just been at the whims of whatever happens, and we kind of adjust according to what happens. But the more we kind of feel ownership of the system and the people that we vote into or out of office, I feel like the more we're gonna feel like we actually have control of, you know, the system that we're living in and the society that we're a major part of. So I think part of it is just educating ourselves on that process so that we don't feel like we just have to accept whatever is handed to us at the end of every election. And I think for so long it has been that case. So I think more of us that joins in on this process, the more we're going to feel empowered to speak our opinions and just even know what different issues there are to, you know, differentiate on. So I think a lot of it is just educating ourselves, and I think that's super important for everyone, let alone our community.
I actually want to tease that out a little bit, and I apologize for assuming otherwise, Osric, but as someone who is, as you said, not allowed to vote but still engaged in the process, I think there's something to that for communities. Like, for example, if you're 17 and you can't vote, that doesn't mean you can't be involved, right? Or if you are a green card holder, if you're a resident and you're not allowed to vote, you can still be involved in the process. And I guess this is for the entire panel. Like, why is that? How do we get people just involved, even if you can't vote? If you're, like I said, if you're 17 or if you're a green card holder, but the policies that are enacted at the national and at the local levels affect your lives. How do you get involved, even if you can't necessarily?
I mean, on a personal, like, on my own personal interest, like, I still pay taxes. Even though I can't vote, I still pay American taxes, state, federal. So I'm paying into this system, and to some degree I do benefit in terms, like, I drive on the roads. There are certain things that I do, you know, take, but for the most part, I am very much a part of this society, and I want to know where my money is going, and I ideally would like it to go to places that I would actually want it to go to. So I want to be involved. And I think for everyone, this is really our practice of being part of this greater society. Like, as much as I like to imagine myself living on an island someday, not needing to deal with anyone, we're in quarantine right now. It kind of feels like that, but we're in a society, we're in this community that is this country, and we have to learn to work together. And this, you know, the election process is that. You know, we get to debate, hash out all of our sentiments on all of these different issues, and ideally come to a nice medium in theory where we all kind of like, okay, well, I'll concede on this if we get that. You know, it's just, how do we want to shape the rules and the laws of the society that we live in? You know, and I think that's a wonderful thing on democracy.
And it seems like, because, you know, to take the name of the organization that's hosting this webinar, because it's 2020, it feels like this election year, it kind of hits a little different. I don't know if it's because of the quarantine, if it's because of the pandemic, if it's because of the administration that's currently in power, if it's because of the racism that we as Asian Americans feel. But because of all of those things that I just mentioned. But Michele, why do you think this particular election year is so important, especially when it comes to the Asian American vote?
It feels like this. I don't think any of us saw the pandemic coming, but it feels like a culmination of a lot of things. It's like, well, you thought that was bad. Like 2016. I think it's just tough because I know, traditionally speaking, you know, a lot of Asian American children, young people were taught by our elders to like keep our nose to the grindstone, just stay out of trouble. But on a general level, I feel like whether we like it or not, it is our country. And I feel this more and more in quarantine, you know, thinking about like, I should just move to Europe, this or that, you know, like all these wild daydreams. But I know that even if I was like in some sort of like villa in Tuscany, I'd still feel guilty because through and through, I'm an American. That's never going to change, and I don't want it to change. So I think that in order for our issues to be heard and considered, obviously we need to, I was going to curse, give a shit.
Yeah.
So I think we just got to band together and really touch on the, I feel like for the most part, young people, for the most part, are pretty politically active, especially now, at least, you know, people that I know and converse with for the most part, right? I feel like older Asian Americans, I guess, like those who are more, I guess, not really attuned to politics, and I can really only speak to like my family members, are just sort of like out of it. I feel like if we really hit on the fact that like it's more than just, you know, them, it's about like their generations, like the generations after them, like it's more than just us. Like if we just really hit on the fact that this is about your children, your children's children, if they are to stay in America and become Americans, we deserve to be a part of the country that, you know, welcomed us and raised us.
So I want to actually jump off the point that Michele made about you know, kind of like just having a seat at the table, right? Being part of the conversation. And, you know, if you think about this idea, the stereotype of the Asian American being like kind of just put your head down and not rock the boat, don't be the nail that sticks out. Romen, as someone who worked specifically in Iowa, where there is not a large community of Asian American Pacific Islanders, did you find it difficult to like get campaigns and political parties engaged in that community in particular because of this idea that like, well, Asians they don't really, that's, as Michele said, they don't give a shit. So why should we put our resources into turning out the Asian American vote in places like Iowa or, you know, other states where it's perceived that there aren't any Asian Americans?
Right. No, I mean, that's a great question. And I think that, you know, we are at risk of becoming a self-fulfilling prophecy and basically saying, letting these people think to themselves, oh, well, this group doesn't turn out, so therefore we won't invest in them. And then when we see that they're not investing in us, then we sort of sit on the sidelines. And I think it's up to us to change that. Now, I don't think the fact that, say, Iowa is such a white state is necessarily as big of an impediment, or at least shouldn't be as it is. If you look at the fact that in 2008, Barack Obama won very handedly the Iowa caucuses, which led to his election as president. Iowa, at least at that point, was a state in the 90th, over 90% of the state was white. So we elected an African-American president, which I guess shows, among other things, that we don't necessarily just vote amongst racial lines. So it is okay to sort of go out there and say, we may not make up the majority or the plurality of this state, but there are certainly enough of us to make a huge impact. But it is on us to sort of go out there and say that. I remember, for example, when I was working on the re-election in 2012, we were very good at reaching different constituency groups. The Obama campaign was. And if you walked into a field office, you would see signs, of course, African Americans for Obama, anything down to kindergarten teachers for Obama, sportsmen for Obama. What we did not have were Asian American Pacific Islander posters for Obama. And so I remember asking, how do I get one of those? And the answer was basically, there's not enough support for us to justify spending a budget on those. So if you want them, you can go online and pay $20 to get 3 posters to, you know, to put up in your window or whatever. And, you know, that's a damn shame, because I guarantee you we are going to turn out at least as much as some of those other constituencies that I mentioned, but it doesn't happen unless we sort of, you know, unfortunately have to demand it.
Can you, Osric, kind of jumping off that point where you talked about like what it means to be involved and to get involved, to jump off of Romen's point, like how do you think it, you know, you're in California, so like, do you feel like sometimes Asian voters are not the majority, but there's a significant portion of Asians in the community, like so, compared to somewhere like Iowa where there isn't as many Asians? Like, do you feel like there's a disconnect between the communities based on how many there are and in the states where they're more populous?
Sorry, you cut off a little bit during that question.
Oh, sorry, it's the internet, you know. No, I was just saying, like, in terms of how many, you know, Asian Americans are in a state like California, for example, do you feel like sometimes Asian American voters are taken for granted in places like California, Hawaii, New York?
I mean, I feel like Asian American voters are taken, you know, advantage of or just for granted everywhere. And in some ways, it's a lot easier for us to kind of like get together and rally as a group because there are so many of us. But I think a lot of the big states like California, like there's a sense of, and this is just beyond our community, it's just there's a sense that our vote doesn't really matter. And so we don't really go out and do it. And then when you're in a smaller state, like let's say I have some cousins in some of the red states, they also feel like it doesn't matter because they're too small to do anything. And so I think on both sides, it feels like, okay, well, it's going to go this way anyway, so we don't have to get involved, or it's going to go that way, so we don't have to get involved. So what's the point of getting involved? And I think part of what we need to do before we just like go out and vote is just to like get to know the people who are voting. So instead of me just going out there, what I would do like in Canada is I have a household of like 7 people. We just have, you know, big family. And so we get to discuss among ourselves. And if we decide to coalesce into like the Chow household, well, all of a sudden we have 7 votes instead of just the 1. And all of a sudden we're a bigger coalition. If we do that with our neighbors, all of a sudden, maybe we have 100 votes, right? And instead of feeling like we're just that one singular vote, we start to feel like, you know, instead of a tap, we feel like a punch, right? And I think for us to feel like we have any effect, no matter where we are, we have to start talking amongst ourselves. And there's such a stigma against talking politics, period, let alone, you know, at dinner with people that you really know well and you don't want to rock the boat. But I think it's so important to just start that conversation, and it doesn't really matter where you are. So I think just having anyone to talk to is a good starting point, and then you slowly find your allies from there.
Michele, do you think it's difficult for the Asian AAPI community because, you know, we like to say, you know, we're not a monolith. The AAPI community is as diverse as, you know, the United States of America itself, right? Like there's dozens of
just
languages,
within the umbrella of Asian, there's a lot of ethnicities. So
do you think that adds to the difficulty to kind of like form an AAPI electoral coalition?
Not if we can work together to find common ground on the things that just concern us as human beings. You know, I feel like at a base level, we want to feel like we're a part of something, a nation that is fair, is progressive, is great, all those things. But I agree with, you know, pretty much what Osric said. It sounds very simple, but I know from experience that it can be very hard to talk about those things because you don't want to, you know, like go into fighting mode with the people that you love. And I'm saying this from experience because I have family members who voted for Trump, for example, and certain Thanksgivings have not been great as a result of that. But we do, I mean, I take it upon myself to do so anyways, not to like try to like turn them, but just to at least like initiate the conversation and in the process, hopefully like rope another person into believing that like voting really counts, really matters, and that, you know, your voice matters. And this is like really the easiest and the best way to exercise your right and your voice.
So can I jump on that answer? I think there's a really good point there in that I mean, there's a lot of social issues that, there's a lot of issues, period, that we're going to be divided on, regardless. In any group, there, no one's one way. But I think as a community, rather than focusing on those that we don't agree on, certainly there are a couple of issues that we can all agree on, whether or not, it just be like, I don't know what kind of policies are about representation, but if there are policies specifically that we all agree on, then it doesn't matter if you're Democrat, Republican, Libertarian, whatever. Like, we can just still push for those issues in whichever party, so that, that's in the conversation, whichever side you're on. That might be a nice way.
Yeah, regardless of party or of like specific ethnicity, I guess. Like, we want to be able to celebrate our differences and our distinct cultures, but at the same time be able to come together on certain things that are very important.
Right. And Romen, do you want to jump in on that?
Yeah. So when, one thing that Osric mentioned was his belief that the Asian communities are taken for granted, which I couldn't agree with more. I feel like to some degree, there is almost this feeling that there is no accountability, that if, we are overlooked, no one is really going to call people out on that. And not to in any way, trivialize the struggles of other organizations, but there may be, of other ethnicities and identities and backgrounds. But I feel like to some degree, other groups have done a good job of organizing in such a way that there is sort of an institution that's going to hopefully come after you and call you out if if a politician missteps and if you do something extremely racist or inappropriate. And I think to some degree, our communities are, lagging behind on that a little bit, such that folks think they can get away with something with things against us. One thing that comes to mind is right after the Super Tuesday vote a couple months ago. I remember seeing a fairly well-known data analyst sort of going over what had happened in the Bay and, how they had voted in that area in California. And he had a breakdown of all these different demographics, basically saying, here are how Caucasians voted, here are how Latinos voted, here are how African Americans voted. What he did not mention was how Asians and Asian Americans voted. What's insane about that is that Asian Americans make up a plurality of that area. So to ignore the single biggest, and it gets, I see you nodding your head, Austin. It gets even better. My friend, what was that?
The Bay Area?
Yeah, the Bay Area. So my friend called out the data guy on Twitter and said, basically, why would you not mention Asian Americans in this? We're a plurality. And the guy's answer, really nuanced, of course, was, well, because there's a character limit on Twitter and you can't include every organization.
Wow.
To some degree, though, it goes beyond just some idiot who is tweeting that. I mean, he clearly has bought into this idea that it's okay to overlook this group, and that, again, there will be no accountability. My one friend tweeting at him was maybe not enough to change it, but it is to some degree on us to make it clear that we need to be included. And
that's the same way that how all the news media treated Andrew Yang. They kept excluding him from so many polls and stuff. It was just so aggravating.
Yeah, and just to jump off of Andrew Yang's candidacy, I think we also forget that there were multiple Asian American candidates for president this year, right? Like, that's the other thing that gets lost. Going back to the idea of like the community being so diverse and so large, you had mixed race Asians in the race. You had the South Asians in the race, right? So like, I think a lot of these things do get swept under the rug for whatever reasons. And this is how I'm going to segue to the actual topic for the day. And we've been talking about like national politics, but the name of this webinar is Let's Get Local, and to really focus on local elections. And part of the reason why I wanted this webinar to be about local elections is that 2020, 2024, 2016, like every 4 years, everyone's engaged, everyone's like roaring to go, but then we're not roaring to go in 2021 or 2022 or 2023, right? Like the years in between presidential elections. And those, in my opinion, are the ones that really matter. If you think back, and Romen can attest to being in the Obama administration, if you think back to that historic win in 2008, 2 years later, the Tea Party took over, and then for the next like 6 years of his presidency, he had to deal with an intransigent Congress, and that was all because the turnout was depressed in the midterms. And for all of the flaws and faults of the Obama administration, a lot of that is on the fact that we didn't have majorities for 6 of the 8 years he was president. So, and that's because we didn't turn out in local elections, congressional elections. So how can we flip that script? How can we, as Asian Americans, how can we lead the charge to be the ones that really get, down to the nitty gritty of local politics? Let's start with you, Romen, since again, you are a veteran of that administration.
I mean, as you said, it was devastating. And look, a lot of the Tea Party, what they stood for was based on racism and bad faith. But to their credit, they got the job done in terms of making their voices heard and being able to win these elections that in many ways sort of crippled what we were able to do for the next 6 years. And we need to be better at responding to that. I mean, the Koch brothers, you hear a lot about how much money they dumped into these races. They were literally showing up at city council races that no one has ever heard about, that no one has ever cared about, because they did their research and they did their homework, and they knew that if you flip X minor local board that is made up of 3 members, then these are the real world effects of it. And, I think we have an amazing opportunity right now to do that. I think that we can learn from those lessons, but it's, there's a lot we can learn from what the Republicans were able to do, again, in bad faith and based on really just a lot of awful things. In terms of this question about getting involved locally, we'll get into it. I think there are a ton of reasons why, but I guess, my sort of top line are that, I guess there are really a couple things. One is that not everyone is going to be super bought into the folks at the top of the ticket, and that is okay. I mean, look, it looks like Joe Biden is our presumptive nominee, and whether or not you are a fan of his, you don't have to get involved in that presidential election if you don't want to. You can go and get involved in a local race, and no matter what, the effects are going to trickle up to the top of the ticket. So I think it is sort of a great alternative that many of us have if, we are not necessarily feeling X candidate running for Senate, X position that we may not feel like may make a difference. If we start out small, then we will have that, whether intended or not, effective of influencing those presidential races and Senate races. And it's a way to sort of do everything.
I'm glad you named the idea of like not being enthused for whoever's at the top of the ticket, because I think probably the greatest enemy to getting involved in politics is apathy and cynicism, right? I mean, you speak about the Republicans, they kind of like feed on the idea of like, let's make everyone think government sucks and government's broken, so that when we go into government and break it, they're not going to like government and not be involved, right? Like it's a cyclical thing. How do we combat that cynicism, Michele? Like what is one way, you talked about talking to like your relatives who probably voted a different way, but like the flip of that is like, how do you talk to people who are like, you know what, pox on both their houses, it's all corrupt, I'm not voting. Like how do you deal with that attitude? And then how can being involved locally be one of the remedies?
Well, for the first half of that question, I think I just really have to like circle back to this idea that I'm hoping to, always come back to, because I admittedly can get very apathetic and cynical just like as a person. But I always come back to this idea of like thinking about how this is more than just me. It's about like all the young children and everybody that's involved and who's, part of this country as well. So I think if we just learn to like look outside of ourselves and think about how like we want to create a world that, we dream of or whatever, like, I think it's a really good idea to always go back to A, and B, as far as like how to get involved on a local level. I also admittedly don't know that much about that as well. I've been trying to figure out ways to do that myself, especially in quarantine. But I think
you're gonna get more local than that, right?
I know, but I think, I don't know, this is like one way that I'm using social media currently. I'm like feeding myself little, like only small amounts, because that's all I can handle each day. But using social media, I guess, to just start that conversation and being involved in like this project, for example, and just talking about that, like talking everyone's ears off about that, whether they want to listen to me or not. So anytime I get a chance to do that over social media or even person to person, I take. And I guess I would just have to ask Romen what else I would have to do to get involved on a local level. But it totally matters. It may seem small, but it's totally going to have effect.
Yeah.
It's all intertwined.
Well, Osric, I see you nodding, and I know that, the last time we spoke, you mentioned about how, just living, in your local community, there are things that you see that you can have a direct effect on because it's affecting you locally.
Yeah, well, I want to, what Romen said about the trickle up effect, I think it is so true. I think most of us has been brainwashed with this idea that, and this is in economics as well and in politics, that it is a trickle down effect. Once you affect what's at the top, it comes down. But I feel like it's actually very much the opposite, right? It's the people, we're the people that we can actually control the economy. In politics, we elect these little officials that will fight their way up, which will fight, and it goes all the way up to the president. So I think we have to be invested in our local communities. And I think for me, that's the key, because I've been apathetic for most of my life. I just didn't care. And honestly, I was looking at my mom, who takes the time to get to know our neighbors. And I just thought that was the cutest thing. And then I realized one of my favorite shows in the world is Parks and Recreation, which is about local government and just like really caring about a project. And until you really put yourself in that mindset, it's really hard. So I'll say, like, right before quarantine happened, I heard that, like, we were already starting to quarantine here. And I heard that West Hollywood wasn't giving parking tickets for people who didn't move their cars because people want to stay in. And Burbank hadn't done that yet. And I had half a mind to go down to City Hall and like start protesting that, because I'm like, well, you guys want us to stay in, but you're going to give us tickets if we don't move our cars? That's crazy. So I think having like little issues like that where you can actually fight for, and that if you show up, if you bring people, you can actually change someone's mind that affects the policy, that affects your everyday life. That's a great, easy way to kind of start that. So one thing that I love that they started enforcing the rules, that every grocery store here, like, unless you wear a mask, you can't go in. So like, I love that. If they didn't have that and everyone was walking around, then I would think, I mean, if you're in an area where that's not enforced, then I might suggest maybe seeing who you can call and complain about don't show up in person right now. And like, these are the issues that you can actually like fight for, that you can see the effect. And I think once you start connecting your actions into the actual effect of what that might be, it starts really reinforcing the idea that you actually have the power to change something, even if it's really small. Even
small victories matter.
Small things do matter
so much, and they add up. And you realize that if I can get this done, maybe I'll move on to the next step.
So my parents used to fight for street lights in the alleyway. We had a dark alleyway, and they won. Or like a road repavement, they would get everyone in the neighborhood to sign a petition, and we would win those over. And like, I have to remind myself that, like, if we can do that in Canada, surely we can try that here. If there's a stop sign that you need that's like dangerous for kids that are walking around, fight for that, right? I think we have to find those little battles and really just get invested in the community that we live in. And in doing so, I think it helps us really, I think it just helps us enjoy where we're at. It helps us appreciate our city instead of just feeling like this is a transitive place that we're in and we're going to leave at some point, so it really doesn't matter. But it just really helps us feel like we're like rooted into this community, which
and pretty manageable too, right? It's like a certain things like, because so often I find myself like overwhelmed by like the magnitude of everything that's going on. It's like, how can me, like this one small person, like possibly address all these huge issues? Like, I feel like the first step is when you start to go on that journey of being able to do so. Right?
Exactly. I mean, I think it's definitely a weapon against apathy, right? Because what causes apathy is this idea that like, well, the problems are too big. What's my one vote going to matter? But if your one vote gets the streets paved, or your one vote gets the stop sign erected, then it really matters. And you can it's because it's the thing that keeps people from wanting to participate and not just voting. Like voting is not the only way to participate. It's going out and talking to your mayor, going to city hall, protesting. Like those are all, except please don't show up with assault rifles when you protest, please. But there are other ways to participate, and then when you do that at the local level and you see the results, I think that's what breaks through the apathy. I'm glad Osric brought up, the pandemic and quarantine, because if there's anything that's been illustrative of how important it is to have, strong local leadership, whether it's your mayor, your governor, your city council, the way we're responding to the pandemic is proving that local and state officials are the ones taking control. Romen, how is COVID-19 kind of illustrating the importance of local politics?
Absolutely. And I was going to say thank you as well, Osric, for bringing that up. I think I truly can't think of a time when it was more clear what the effects of state and local governments are. I mean, if someone had told you within the past few years, at the last election cycle even, that the city councilors you elect right now will, in a few months, in a few years, be the ones deciding how big gatherings are allowed to be, how big these ordinances are, that will literally affect hundreds, thousands, collectively millions of lives. I mean, and it comes down to just a small number of votes. It's absolutely wild. It goes beyond that. You see things like, sort of local ordinances about increasing the minimum wage during, say, the pandemic, or about housing and what the laws are in terms of, if you're paying your rent on time, or if you can't be evicted because of, not paying your power and water bill. I mean, there has never been a bigger illustration of sort of the livelihoods that are at stake than this quarantine. In some ways, it's sort of it can be a blessing in disguise, in that it's a lot better than we find out about it's better we find out about it right now than we do in late November or December, where we say, oh, wow, we are now realizing the effects of this, that we really have a few months to really get going and hit the ground running on this. There was a question before about sort of getting involved locally. Michele, you made it sound like I'm an expert in that, which I can't necessarily claim to be.
Well, you know more about it than I do, that's for sure. So
I worked in politics. I'm good at pretending that I do.
And I'm an actor, so anyways.
Yeah, exactly. I guess in a way, me too. One thing I was going to say, I mean, I think it's cool. I think promoting how this panel came to be is sort of was a good lesson for me in the way that sort of politics and involvement work, right? I started seeing a lot of these organizations, Asian Americans in the arts and whatnot, really coming out, groups I'd never heard of, promoting and saying, oh, tune into this, and this is going to be a really cool thing. And it highlighted the importance of having one another's backs. I think that it could be something so small that you see a candidate you like, and you like them on Facebook, or you retweet them. It just creates this snowball effect where that gives more people that look like us, people that believe in the same things as us, the confidence to run for office and to be more outspoken, knowing that, again, something so small as boosting them on social media, et cetera, will have an impact. I think that even the most small gestures like that go a very long way. Beyond that, when someone comes up to you with a clipboard when you're walking down the street, give them 30 seconds of your time. As annoying as it may be, I think that the more that we sort of reward the people who are doing that work right now, the more it sort of builds a bench for the future. Back to this question of, whether or not, I talked about this before, whether or not you're excited about the candidates at the top of the ticket. And I really do feel for a lot of strong progressives that don't feel like they're getting their voices heard this election cycle. But what you can do is go out to your local races and find the most progressive folks and get them elected and start building this bench right now. In election cycles in the years to come, we will have an army of progressives, of people from our same demographics that now have political experience and are ready to run for office. So it's really about sort of making an investment right now. And sorry, I know that strayed a little bit from just talking about the pandemic.
No, not at all. I mean, I think it's actually really relevant because, we talked earlier about how, like, the Tea Party 10 years ago and the Koch brothers had, like, they played the long game. They saw 2020 10 years ago, right? And they saw, like, if we start putting, these people on city councils and school boards, they're going to bubble up to national office, and that's what's happened. And progressives haven't done that. And how do we do that? We support progressive mayors, we support progressive school board members, we support progressive state delegates, right? Like, I'm a native of Virginia, so like seeing how Virginia has evolved in my lifetime is mind-blowing. Virginia, for the first time, is completely a blue, it's not even a purple state anymore, it's a completely blue state. And it's the hard work of activists on the ground and people pushing the governor leftward, right? And voting for state delegates and state senators who are progressive, that the legislature is now progressive. That's an amazing thing that would not have been conceivable 10 years ago. But it's the work of people at the local level voting in your local state delegates. And also, I think the other thing, being a Virginian, is that's kind of attuned me to paying attention to elections in between presidentials, is that we vote on odd number years, right? Like, we vote for governor in odd number, like 2019 was when we voted for governor. Well, I say we, I don't live in Virginia anymore, but I'm still a Virginian at heart, I'm from Virginia, so shut your mouth. But, we vote for Virginians, we vote for governor in 2019, right? So that makes us 3 years in a row, like where we're engaged, right? Because the midterms are 18, the governor's 19, and then president's 20. Like, you're almost engaged in politics every year, and that's what we need people to be. It's not every 4 year thing, right? It's an every year thing. Every November, every second Tuesday in November is an election day, even if it's not a presidential one. So I guess the question is, how do we make that appealing to people? How do we make voting every year, not just presidential year, sexy? Osric.
How to make voting sexy?
How do we make voting sexy?
So many ideas. Man. How to make voting sexy? I don't know if they're.
Don't you?
I think it's just making it part of, because right now it definitely feels like a special event, right? But like a 4 year special event, kind of like the Olympics, when it shouldn't be. Realistic, like it should be a national holiday. There's so many random celebrations that happen. Like, we have national everything days. We should put more focus on voting, because it actually matters.
Yeah, like, what if calendar, like makers or whatever put those election reminders or whatever on the days? It should just be listed and make it easy for people. That's like number one. Just make it easy for them. Like, nothing there.
How to make voting sexy? Come back to me on that one.
I have an idea, but it's kind of off the cuff.
Go for it, Michele.
Go for it. Yeah,
it's just like, if you wanted to tackle, it's like a way to tackle just like representation, but also voting. If you want, like, when you say sexy, I take it like literally. Like, if you wanted to address like Asian masculinity with men, like, make a calendar with like Asian men that could lead studio movies, and also put the like elections in there on the days. Like, there you have it. There we go. And all the proceeds go towards the 2020 project, or anyways.
So panelists, please, in the chat, if you say yes, if you want a calendar of topless Osric Chau.
Buy it.
For
but you have to do one in your costume.
I'm just thinking of like, for voting for anything, you need the right incentive. That's all it is. And if you don't have the incentive to vote for yourself or for your community, then you kind of rely on outside factors, whether it be the government, who I find for a lot of people in the government aren't necessarily incentivized to incentivize people to vote, right? They would rather people not vote, because currently they understand the system, and if the rest
can control it.
Right. If the other half of the country decides to show up and vote, they have no idea what's going to happen. That's probably going to scare the living daylights out of them.
Yeah, it's causing trouble. They don't want that.
I feel like it really comes down to community organizers at this point. Like, I feel like it's up to all of us to like not just go out and vote, but like host voting parties where like every year, you do 4th of July, Thanksgiving. What other things do you celebrate in America? Easter, I don't know. But you can actually do a gathering and host a party, and then it's like, okay, at this time, then we will all go out and vote. Like, you can make it a communal experience rather than just a one-person thing.
Mhm.
And it might be fun. Maybe a national talk politics over dinner, awkward dinner party.
Wait, isn't that Thanksgiving? I thought that was already the holiday.
I know, but I feel like to make it a communal event where we can actually celebrate it instead of just having it, kind of be swept under the rug, which it feels like a lot of us do. It's a step. I know. How do you incentivize it? Romen, do you have any ideas on that?
I especially wanted to talk about what you mentioned, Osric, about sort of the role that government plays in this, and I think you touched on something very important. I mean, it goes well beyond apathy, right? This is not just a question about people not caring enough. This is a concerted effort, largely to stop people from doing it. This comes back to another reason that it is important to get involved locally. That it literally, based on what state you live in and what community you live in, affects how easy it is to vote. And
Right.
whether or not you have to jump through these insane barriers to show ID, to request a ballot months in advance, to get it by mail or not. I mean, it is designed to look like folks just don't care enough to turn out. But it really is, not to be wearing a tinfoil hat here about this grand conspiracy, but this is part of a major effort to just not get young people to vote. It goes back to what some of you guys mentioned earlier, that the best case scenario for some of these groups is for, folks like us, folks younger than some of us, to say, oh, well, the system is broken, so I quit and I give up, and, I'm not going to do anything about this. And, you're asking about this, Keith. There was also, I saw a question that Sopan asked, which is, very similar along the same lines of how do we get people to turn out more than just every year. I think we need strong laws. I think we need, I think it was your state, Keith, that just made Election Day a national holiday.
Mm-hmm.
I think that every place that people who care about this issue, and it turns out to largely be progressives are doing a better job expanding the right to vote. I think that every place that we win elections and win control, we need to have the law on our side. We need to make voting as easy as possible. And don't get me wrong, I also want to see a calendar with Osric shirtless, but I think that on top of that, we need to use the law because our opponents are doing it. Our opponents are doing everything they can to use the law and to use their positions in elected office to make voting as hard as possible. It's on us to make voting as easy as possible, beyond just caring and doing fun stuff. It's largely a legal issue.
Yeah, and I think that's really important, and a perfect illustration of that was the Wisconsin primary a couple weeks ago, or was it months ago? Now, who knows? What is time? But when Wisconsin held their primary amidst the pandemic, the thinking was, the Republican legislature and the Republican Supreme Court of Wisconsin purposefully refused to move and postpone the election because they figured, well, our people are the only ones who are going to come out to vote, and they had this judgeship that was up for election, and this really conservative judge going up a really liberal challenger, and because progressive turned out in that primary, amidst the pandemic, the liberal judge won that election. And that's an example of how organizing, how, it was literally the bullet or the ballot, right? Like people were voting for their lives and risking their lives to vote. And that's something that I think needs to translate to every location, every district in the country. I mean, and just going back to like tying that into being Asian American, the idea of we are like a little over 6% of the population, but we're also more than 5% of eligible voters in like 100 congressional districts in the country. So, we can show up and show out for candidates, whether they're congressional candidates or whether they're state or local candidates. And especially in states, we're talking about representation, but like, our government is literally representation. We can show up in states where, Asians aren't necessarily thought of as states aren't necessarily thought of as Asian states, but like somewhere like Georgia, where there are large Asian communities who we could put in, state and local senators and delegates who are Asian American representing Georgia, like representing, you know, Iowa, right? Like focusing on those kinds of like hyper local races and looking for the Asian American candidates to run in those races, I think is something that we can also push for.
I think I wanted to actually note this earlier. I think it was Samuel mentioned in the comments about Bernie Sanders' campaign was really, really good in, you know, the Iowa race for finding these traditionally overlooked communities, you know, largely Asian American communities. The Bhutanese community, for example, is one that they really, nobody thinks to do that. And as a result, it's really winning at the margins as a result of giving a voice to this group that had, you know, is just not traditionally engaged. They ended up effectively, it was a tie for the Iowa caucuses, and that is organizing at its best. I have some friends in Iowa who were involved in that race on the Bernie campaign, and the election's done, the political operatives have left, the candidates are no longer here, and I know people who are still, as a result of that initial involvement, now volunteering with the Bhutanese community to help with COVID stuff and translate stuff for them and make sure they know what's going on. That's something that was born out of getting involved in an election, and now it is having very, very real world consequences for the better.
I mean, you talked about winning at the margins. Remember, Hillary Clinton lost 2016 by 75,000 votes in 3 states, Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania. In those 3 states, there were over 1 million Asian Americans, right? So like if you organize Asian American voters in those 3 states, you don't lose by 75,000 votes. So that's going back to what kicked off this conversation about, you know, Romen's experience in Iowa, like looking for every single vote. Like every candidate should be, you know, working for every single vote, because the idea that, you know, my vote doesn't matter, blue state, red state, whatever, you know, when you can become president by winning by 75,000 votes, every vote matters.
But Keith, I heard on cable news television that we need to do a better job appealing to rural white voters in Ohio in order to win. Yet here you are saying that we should reach out to these other communities. I'm so confused.
Well, if only there were more characters allowed on Twitter. We wouldn't know that. I think we want to switch to the Q&A. A bunch of y'all have asked some really amazing questions. A lot of you are doing it anonymously, so what up with that? You should be proud of your question. So let me pick on someone who actually was brave enough to say his name. John Lee asks, given the current racist targeting of APIs during this COVID crisis, how should APIs inject themselves into local political discourse? Who wants to tackle that?
Wait, what was the question? Sorry, blanked out.
I'll ask it again. I believe you should be able to see it too, Osric. Given the current racist targeting of APIs during COVID, how should APIs inject themselves into local political?
Oh, I'll take this one. I find that I don't like to direct confrontation. That's probably something to do with me being Asian. But I feel like if we just go against those people that are saying those racist things, it really doesn't get us anywhere. I do know that there are allies. That is one thing I am certain of. And my preferred strategy always is to incentivize our allies to become our champions. And someone else fights for you, which is way better. So there are politicians, there are people who speak out, and all of us can just, thank them, give them that injection of dopamine that makes them feel good for standing up for us. And in doing so, hopefully more people will kind of come up, and at some point we reach this critical mass where we don't even have to say anything anymore because people just get it. That's my preferred strategy, and it's less draining on you instead of yelling at someone who's probably just gonna yell back, and then it's only gonna escalate, and it just gets really messy. So the people that are doing it, they're gonna be doing it, and it's gonna take a lot more energy than we probably want to expend to kind of convince them. So I personally like to incentivize and encourage the people that are natural allies that want to do it, and just thank them for doing what they're already going to do.
Excellent. David Tran asks, oh, go ahead, Romen. Did you want to jump on
I just want to say really quickly, one of the big things we focused on the Obama campaign was the importance of telling your personal story and making sure that all politics and all elections are completely personal. And that means that when horrible things are happening right now to these communities that don't necessarily affect other groups, though I'm sure they do in their own way, but specifically now during this COVID situation and what's happening to Asian Americans, it is very important that in a non-confrontational manner, as you said, Oz, we convey that to people. It is important that our friends and coworkers and neighbors know sort of, I experienced this racism. These are real world things that are happening right now, and that we can put our own personal faces and tell our own stories about what's happening, rather than this theoretical hate crimes are on the rise somewhere, due to a Trump administration. I think it's important for us to use this awful situation to tell stories about what's going on and how they affect us personally.
David Tran asks, how do people who are working in 9 to 5 get their voices heard when so many cities hold public hearings during the work day? That's a really good question.
That was a really good question. Romen, do you know anything that we don't know? Are there other ways of doing that?
It is a tough situation. I think we can all agree that the working class right now is just getting battered and really left out. I wish I had a great answer for that. At the end of the day, it's going to mean that folks who are working so hard during the day have to do even more when they get off of work and, use their free time to get involved. I think that's what it takes, though. And I think it takes us who are more privileged, who have the time to be making those calls on behalf of our neighbors that we know are on the front lines working hard. And whether that's, working in hospitals or working in factories or delivery folks, like, it is up to us to, use our own privilege on behalf of those who may not necessarily have a voice.
Organize, organize, organize. Those are my 3 thoughts on that.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, if you're not able to because you're working, maybe you can talk someone else into doing it. But yeah, I think it's up to everyone. Like if you have the privilege of time and resources to kind of take out your day to do that, then, hopefully you have it in you to do so. And it's the same for like all these charity fundraisers. Like, as much as I would love to raise money, like I recognize that there's a lot of people who can't donate. And, if I'm fundraising for something, I don't want everyone to donate if they can't do it, right? You only want the people with the means to do so. And the sentiment certainly helps. So just, if you can't do it, you can't do it. There is sacrifices that will be required, and hopefully someone with the means to will be able to step up.
I mean, if only workers had a way to, collectivize and organize and form unions of people to have representatives voice their concerns to the government.
The system exists. It's a union.
And there's a reason why people have been trying to disband unions for the last 50 years too. Like, that's to your point about making voting hard, destroying unions is because of a way to screw working people to get out of the process. Here's another question. I'd also love to hear them talk about the states where a lot of AAPIs, like California, Hawaii, feel like they don't make a huge impact on the national level because they're blue states, or they vote last, like Hawaii. How does being engaged locally make sure your vote still matters? I mean, I think this goes back to what we were saying about how even if your vote, quote unquote, doesn't matter at the national level, you're still voting for your dog catcher. You're still voting for your school board. You're still voting for your roads getting paved. And I think that's why voting matters, even if it doesn't necessarily affect the presidential.
Well, I think it matters tremendously. And here's the moment that I realized. I realized that the representative of my district is freaking Adam Schiff. And I'm like, what? That guy? I've seen him all over the news. I know Adam Schiff. Like, Nancy Pelosi is in San Fran somewhere. Like, all of these people are on the national stage. It starts locally anyways, right? And those are the people that, make the big decisions. It's like, we're the people putting them in power. It's up to us to make them know what our issues are. And so, like, to that effect, I think it's super important, especially when they're doing any kind of massive campaign. Like, let's go out of our way, talk to those campaign staffers, talk to those volunteers, because they're going to talk back to their uppers, and it's going to go all the way back to the top. If we make it known, like, this is an issue that I care about. And a lot of us, we don't like to engage. People knock on your doors. It's super weird. Usually they're Mormon. But if they happen to be a staffer, like, it might be nice for us to just kind of open that conversation and like really just let our issues be known. It's a very easy way that if they're coming right at you. Sometimes I'll see them at the grocery store. Like if the staff is on the ground, like talk to them because they're going to report to their boss.
Awesome. There's a question just came in from Clarence Dang for Michele and anyone else dealing with family or friends they have strong political disagreements with. What have you found that works best engaging with them and making productive conversation instead of just fighting?
Getting them to think outside of themselves. That is the number one most effective, and I'll keep this short, strategy that I've employed. God, this is so, it's like, see, I'm like nervous talking about it now. That's how like polarizing it is for me. I'm not conditioned to talk about these sort of things, but we have to do it. Just to think about like, okay, like you as an adult think these things and can survive in this, but what about your children? What about your grandchildren? What about these people that you care about? What kind of world do we want them to live in? And then it always kind of gets them.
I think it's such when we discuss a lot of the issues, it comes from such an emotional place that it's really hard for us to kind of prioritize. And I think in life in general, it's really hard for us to prioritize. Like I'll put in as much effort as I like ordering lunch as I do like deciding which house to buy sometimes, right? Like we don't really prioritize that in our minds. And so sometimes you get fixated on like the one subject that like, this is the end all be all. And let's say I have a family member who's the polar opposite of me in terms of my social issues and values. And so let's take gay marriage and we can have this discussion like, okay, well, like I'm voting for this person, you're voting for that person. And they'll be like, well, I'm voting for this person because they're against gay marriage. And I'm like, okay, well, that's your opinion. We can discuss this and we're probably not going to go anywhere. But here are some other issues. So would you ban gay marriage if you had to pay $20,000 more in taxes per year? Where do you prioritize that, right? What is that worth to you? And some people, it is that. Would you ban gay marriage if it meant that you had to pay more taxes and you risk the lives of these relatives here because this is a situation that this policy that candidate is also proposing? And I think if you actually like write out the policies and the issues and where you stand, it's a lot easier for you to prioritize, and then together you'll be like, okay, in the overall scheme of things, there is no candidate that has every priority like along the same lines. And certainly, even as family members, we don't agree. But in terms of like this household, what do we want most? Like those social issues, like, yeah, as much as I hate gays getting married, I guess it doesn't really affect our household. And collectively, we're going to pay like $50,000 more taxes if we go with that candidate. So I guess we'll go here, right? And I think it's just like prioritizing those issues, and then and it's kind of tedious, but there are some sites that really do that nicely. And it's just like what actually matters to you, what actually affects your family, and it's just having that discussion. It's like, okay, I know you want that. I definitely don't want that. But what are the other things? Do you want this along with that? And how much do you want that? And I think once you write it down, it's really easy. It's like, okay, well, you don't want gay marriage, but it's really a number 7 for you. So you don't want to make a decision based off of your number 7 priority. And once you actually list it out, I think it's a lot easier to start going into that discussion in a more like calm mind, because you can go back and forth on all these issues. But really at the end of the day, there are probably some that you really care about that you don't even think of, and it's because it's not in the national conversation. Like
you said, there are some sites that will lay that out for you, like listing out each candidate's.
I have an app called Kaleidoscope or something, and it just has all the candidates and their
Kaleidoscope? Oh, I didn't know.
Kaleidoscope.
Oh.
And it's like, this is your candidate. This is your district representative. This is what they.
I love that.
Here's what's.
Why don't I know about that? That's great.
And then, Oz, if I can give the more heartless, emotionally detached answer from a political staffer.
Yes, please.
And look, it's difficult when we're dealing with family and loved ones, but my personal philosophy is at some point you just kind of let it go. There are folks who have made up their minds, who've supported people that you and I know are supporting things that we can't even fathom. And at some point, save your time and energy trying to persuade young people we know agree with us, marginalized communities we know agree with us to turn out, or people who may legitimately be more undecided. But I mean, again, this is sort of a pragmatic, arguably more cynical mindset, but coming strictly from the way we win elections and persuade as many people as possible. I think it's important to acknowledge, not going to change this person's mind. Let's put the time and energy into, into folks whose mind we can change, and I guess do our best just to not think about it when it's some family and friends, which sucks, which is awful. I have close friends who are, believe in things that I would never, ever believe in. But to some degree, I think it's a waste of my time and energy. And I'd say theirs, but I don't really care about their time and energy.
That's so funny. Okay, I'm gonna one up you. Okay, Mom, you're gonna vote that way. If you vote that way, I'm gonna go out of my way to find 5 non-voters to vote the other way, which makes your vote 5 times less effective.
Boom, done.
Well, I definitely think that's a strategy. Like we, to jump off Romen's earlier joke about, focusing on the rural white voter, and again, instead of, just expanding the electorate. Like if you can expand the electorate, you don't have to worry about those mythical swing voters, right? Like instead of engaging all your energy changing people's minds, you just find people who are like-minded and form coalitions. That's how you do it. We're going to have to end it there. I want to thank my panelists for such an amazing and engaging conversation. I want to go around the horn one more time and let everyone share their social media handles and how people can follow you and get involved with the stuff that you do. So we'll start with Romen and then we'll go around. How can people find you on the internet, Romen?
Of course, both on Twitter and Instagram, it is just at Romen Borsellino, first name, last name. Thank you guys for letting me join this. I think if we were to average out all of our collective followers on social media and then take just me out of the mix, it would probably spike by several 100,000. So,
Michele, how can people find you on the internet?
I am at Michele Selene Ang on Instagram and at Michele Selene on Twitter. Hit me up.
At Osric Chau. If you can spell my name, you'll find me.
Be all mysterious. I am The Real Chow on Twitter at The Real Chow, and follow the Nerds of Color at The Nerds of Color. I want to thank everyone for tuning in. I want to especially thank the 2020 project organizers and ASAM News for co-sponsoring, as well as Act to Change for the support. If you enjoyed this conversation, please save the date for next week's webinar between Bill Powers, Lacey Lugwin, Wright, and Ian Alexander of the OA. It'll be a one-on-one conversation about the 101s of voting for young and first-time voters. Sometime on Wednesday, May 13th at 5, same time at Wednesday, May 13th, 5 p.m. Pacific, 8 p.m. Eastern. Find more on vote-2020-project.org or the 2020 Project social channels at Vote 2020 Project. Thank you to everyone for tuning in.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
And have a good night.
Bye.